Welcome to the Middle-earth Philosopher, where I talk about ideas, people, and relationships within Middle-earth and try to examine them from a philosophical point of view that the people in that world may have held. What is war in Middle-earth? By that, I mean, what's its function? How is it used? I think it's an important question because when most people, whether they are just fans of the books or the TV series or anything else, when they think of the word Middle Earth, peace and living long, healthy lives does not exactly come to mind. Usually, I think what comes to most people's minds is battles. Lots and lots and lots of battles. And I think it's worth examining essentially what purpose that served, in particular for two of its main antagonists, that being Melkor, i.e. Morgoth, and Sauron. Now, this is not to say that they were the only ones who were starting wars in Middle-earth. However, all the wars that had major catastrophic consequences are from these guys. Moreover, I am going to maintain that the two of them treated war very differently from each other, even though on the surface it looks like kind of the same thing, with Sauron being Melkor 2.0. So to begin with, we have to go a little bit into the characteristics and worldviews of these two characters. From this point on, I'm going to refer to Melkor as Morgoth just because it's simpler rather than having to switch back and forth all the time. So I appreciate your patience and bear with me. Now, Morgoth from day zero establishes himself as something of a narcissist. For one reason or another, he feels and wants everything to belong to him. He wants to have his own realm to rule, his own people to rule, his own ability to create. That is separate and detached from Uru Uyuvatar, who created him, and the rest of the spirits. I would actually compare him to a overprivileged first child. What I mean by that being that because he has powers that exceed all the others' powers in their particular areas, he behaves in a fashion that is very similar to a kid who was just the first kid who was born and got all the privileges and just feels like everything should belong to him and he should be first in place for everything. So yes, I am calling Morgoth a divine overgrown child at this point. Now, even though I say that in half jest, it's also kind of a very serious thing because of the fact that Morgoth is responsible for corrupting the world and causing as much destruction, or at least sowing the seeds for that, that happens throughout the entire history of that universe. That being said, though, that is still his behavior. And when it comes to that, that does inform how he perceives and uses war and conflict. Now, Sauron, on the other hand, who is often treated by, seems like a lot of book fans, as almost Morgoth 2.0, is much, much different. Yes, Sauron was malicious. He was a sadist and a psychopath in a lot of different ways. And he establishes this pretty early on during the First Age. But that being said, he doesn't come off to me as a narcissist. His worldview seems to be one of that he feels that it is out of order, it is in chaos and out of control, and he wants to put it into its right place and reestablish it in a place of order and good standing, but by how he defines it. To me, that isn't necessarily narcissism, because he's not like, it's all mine, what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine. Sauron doesn't come off like that. Sauron comes off as, I'm the one who knows what needs to happen, I'm the one who knows what I'm doing, and you're going to follow what I do, or I'm going to kill you. And this view also informs how he uses conflict and war. And now I'm going to go into that. Essentially, war to Morgoth is pretty much an extension of his attitude and his narcissism. Essentially, that almost every time he starts a conflict, whether it was with the Valar or the elves or whoever, it was usually almost as a reaction to something that they did that he didn't like because he was the one who did it. Again, going back to the angry child, he's upset because he's not the one getting all the attention or all the glory or anything that comes as a result of doing said task. So therefore, his response is just to fuck up everything after that point. And that's essentially what he does, whether it's in corruption or deception. And he does this with a lot of the Maiar spirits, as everyone knows. And he's not subtle about it. And because of the nature of these particular Maiar spirits, he can't be subtle about it. Because the Maiar, who are at this time known as the Valar Rukar, later to become Balrogs, as I state in the previous video, rely very much on strength and power in order to establish, who they're going to follow and who they're going to listen to. They will not listen to anyone else otherwise. And for Morgoth in the early days, this was not a problem because he still had a lot of his full power available to him. So intimidating them into, I have more power than you, so you're going to follow me, probably was not really that hard. But Sauron was entirely different. Sauron, he had to coerce somehow. He had to basically pull out the deception card and just kind of get him to see the Valar that he was working for as not being very efficient at what they were doing. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of details on the exact conversation that they had or how Morgoth exactly went about seducing Sauron to his cause. So again, I am going by assumption and guesses here based on behavior patterns. But either way, it does stand that every time Morgoth does eventually go into war, it's because he wants to control everything and own everything. And there's very little strategic or tactical purpose behind that other than an overblown emotional reaction, basically. Albeit at a genocidal and psychotic level. Now, Sauron is an entirely different beast altogether, because Sauron is tactical. Sauron doesn't use war as a blunt hammer. If anything, or at the very least early on, it's a last resort. Sauron's preference seems to be always have been deception. He does this during the First Age when he gets the information of Barahir's whereabouts from one of his rebels who he captures and tricks into revealing that location. He does this throughout the Second Age with the elves when he's trying to set up everything so that he can create the Rings of Power. And he does this during the Third Age when he's trying to get the different other tribes of Middle-earth from different races of men to fight for his cause. That he shows up as a god king. As I had said in another video, I am theorizing that a lot of it was not just based on intimidation, but was also based on truth mixed lies that he told them about the people of the West and Gondor, or just reminded them of the bad blood that existed between their peoples and the people of the West. Either way, you get the point. That Sauron is not the type of person who just goes up to the door and kicks it down. Or I should say in this case, just blows up the fucking house. Rather, Sauron is the type of person who will knock on the door, will introduce himself as someone who's very pleasant or has important information for you, and half of it is going to make sense, so you actually may fall for it. But if you don't fall for it, then he breaks out the Force. Sauron goes to war with the elves after the elves do not fall for the deception. Sauron goes to war with Gondor after his other peoples who he had seduced are just not getting the job done. And in fact, his greatest success was the seduction of Numenor, whereby he didn't have to use force at all. The seduction completely worked to what he wanted to accomplish with it, which was the removal of Numenor off the map and wiping out the people of that island. Now, even though, of course, it wasn't entirely successful, Numenor as a superpower no longer existed after its downfall. So, in that sense, it did work, and the seductions did work and everything. All that to say that war to Sauron is a means to an end. It is not a extension of himself or an expression of some sort of issue or personal tantrum that he may be having, like Morgoth would be having. And it's for that reason, I believe anyway, and some other people I think as well, that I think Sauron was therefore much better at war than Morgoth was. Because even though Morgoth did win, I guess you can say, the war in Beleriand before the reinforcements show up from the west, at the same time, he was not able to gain loyalties except through force and intimidation. Whereas Sauron was able to manipulate people so that they would oftentimes do half the work that an army may not need to do that, thereby saving resources, saving personnel, and at the same time further establishing his hold through stronger means than just the threat of death, which is what the rings were supposed to do in the first place. But that being said, when it does come to use force, he doesn't hold back. Sauron goes full tilt when it comes to, okay, if we're gonna fight, then I'm gonna just fuck you over entirely. There's no half measure with him if it gets to that point. And usually a lot of the alliances that he had formed when he was still deceiving people and seducing people end up helping to reinforce that intention in his fights, which is usually why, in my opinion anyway, that the people of the West are almost always on the back foot whenever going to war with Sauron. There doesn't seem to be any real point where they have an advantage on him, either because they don't have the power to do it, or they don't know he's behind it, or that they themselves will not unite together in order to fight him properly, at least until the War of the Ring. So that's my take on the worldviews of Morgoth and Sauron when it came to war. Morgoth used it as a violent expression of who he was as a person, and Sauron used it as a tool to achieve a tactical and or strategic end to something that was going to help a worldview that he was devoted to.